Okay, so did you hear that? He was found guilty, but not guilty of manslaughter, of the lesser included culpable negligence. So what does this all mean for Mr. Elder? Let's talk a little bit more about it with my very special guest. Always happy to see her, especially on a Monday morning. Law and Crime trial analyst, Jonna Spilbor.
Good morning, Jesse. Always good to be here.
Great to have you. Okay, yeah. Culpable negligence. Manslaughter carried 30 years. What does culpable negligence mean?
It's a misdemeanor in this state, as it is in most states that have the culpable negligence statute. And it means that he can only get sentenced up to 1 year for this crime. Prosecution had felony on the table. The jury came back basically splitting the baby, because remember, in this case, he presented a self-defense defense, which would have netted him an acquittal. Prosecutors wanted a felony. Jury came back with the lesser included, this misdemeanor of culpable negligence, which could only net him up to a year in jail. Problem for this guy, he's committed, on an unrelated matter, several probation violations, which could get him put away for the rest of his life. So this is kind of a, he wants to smile at this verdict, but he's got something much larger looming over his head.
It's not his first rodeo, and we heard about 195 years in relation to those probation violations. We were so concerned about this verdict, so he could only maybe get a year in prison for that, but because of everything else, he could face the rest of his life in prison. My question to you is, what was the jury doing? So did they believe the defense's argument that this was self-defense? How do you go from manslaughter to culpable negligence? What does that mean for layman's terms?
So I kind of like this. If you dissect this verdict, it means that if the lesser included jury instruction were not on the table, what would have happened here? Let's try to get into the jury's mind. Would they have convicted him on the felony, on the manslaughter charge, or would they have given him an acquittal? Because oftentimes when you're charging a jury, that lesser included a jury instruction can either be your best friend or really screw things up. Which way would they have gone? I'd be nice to find out, but you may never find out because they don't have to tell you.
I'm curious to see how this will affect Armando Baptista, the other defendant in this case, who, from what I heard from this whole case, appears to be the main person who stabbed Mr. Knight. He seems to be the real central figure in this case, and Elder was just helping, but we'll have to see what happens. And John, I want you to stand by on this case. Your analysis of the Elder case has been fantastic. So as soon as we have an update, we'll make sure to let you know. But I do want to switch gears here, because our main focus today is going to be the Anthony Kirkland case. How often do you get a serial killer case, and not only a serial killer case, but a guy who's getting a second shot at a sentencing hearing? And we can't wait for that live feed. So as soon as we have it, we'll jump into the courtroom. What I want to do for you right now, in case you missed it, is I want to play you some of the testimony of Sergeant Jennifer Mitch. She is going to discuss discovering the body of one of these victims, and this is Kimya Rollinson. She was 25 years old. Let's play a little of her testimony right now. Okay, so that's some prior testimony in this really exciting case out of Ohio. I'm so glad we're covering it, because I don't know how many people are really focused on this one, and they really should. You have a convicted serial killer in the Midwest who's getting a second shot at a sentencing hearing. Want to bring back on Jonna Spilbor. I got to tell you, brilliant police work from the investigator that we heard last week. He has this man who he believes is suspected of killing multiple women. He finally has him, and he's trying to get him to confess. John, I don't know if you had an opportunity to listen to it, but the police tactics of appealing to this guy's heart as a father, he's slowly getting him to confess to the Esme Kenny murder. It's unbelievable. Do you see this in your line of work, the police tactics to get this confession out?
You know what's so funny? I do applaud the police in this case for getting the confession, but oftentimes when police employ the tactics, I'll put in air quotes, to get a confession, it's often the subject of what we defense lawyers need to attack to get a confession thrown out. But police are allowed to do a number of things. They're allowed to, appeal to the heart. They're also allowed to lie and make up things. They're allowed to do that.
I'm so happy you said that. You know what the investigator said to this guy?
What?
He goes, Anthony, look, I know you're a decent guy. I know you're a decent guy. Now, what is that statement?
That was them schmoozing. That was them,
That's
licking
allowed,
their hand.
right?
And you're allowed to the police are allowed a wide berth in order to do their job. But sometimes it is subject to attack. And they did a great job in this case. I mean, basically, there were a couple of murders here that they probably would not have solved but for this confession.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we only saw the beginning part of it. on Friday. It is going to continue today. It's hours. And each moment is so interesting. We are following it line by line. So as soon as we have the live feed, I'm telling you, do not miss it. We will cover it here on Law and Crime. In the meantime, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. So that's a replay, a discussion about the murder of Esme Kenny, the last and thankfully, final victim of this man, this defendant, this convicted serial killer who's getting another shot at a sentencing hearing. I want to bring back on Jonna Spilbor. As we try to understand what Anthony Kirkland's MO is, every serial killer has an MO. When he was starting to confess about this murder, it seemed that he said his anger got the best of him because she was jogging and bumped into him. That seems to be very different than him killing the other 4 women.
No, I think there's an element of anger in all of these murders because in one of the murders, he got mad because his sexual advances were rebuffed. In the one you just mentioned, he got mad because somebody bumped into him. There's some sort of anger issue going on. And I got to tell you something else. Like, I'm all about second chances.
Right.
But break down this case for a minute. He's already been convicted of 2 killings. He was already sentenced to death for them. Now he gets a do-over. Why, Jesse? He's getting a do-over because of one small sentence the prosecution said during the first penalty phase. You think that's going to change anybody's mind? Now, I know this is a new jury, but come on.
Well, I don't know. That was some statement that Prosecutor Joe Dieter said. He basically said, look, this guy's already going to be in life in prison for 2 other murders. If you don't find him for the death penalty, these other 2 murders are just freebies for him. And that becomes the question. Was that an inappropriate statement? The Ohio Supreme Court said yes, and it was extremely prejudicial to warrant a new sentencing hearing. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, a lot more to discuss in the Kirkland case. That is the defendant lying right to police investigators about not knowing anything about Esme Kenny. But his location where he was picked up would suggest otherwise, and his answers later on definitely suggest otherwise. Let me go back to Jonna Spilbor. So he's picked up sitting on a tree. There are knives sticking out of his pocket. He's right where Esme
Clue
Kenny
number 1
disappears. How does he think he's going to get out of this?
Well, I guess we have to get into the mind of a serial killer, right?
Let's do that.
Let's try. I don't know if we can actually fully get in there. But, when police approach him initially, nobody really just out of the gate says, I killed her and I killed 5 other people. Like, they don't do that. They have to massage him, for lack of a better word. They have to try to pull this information out of him and know which buttons to push in order to get him to talk.
Don't you think it was genius to appeal to his sentiment as a father? Like, you look at this guy, what can you appeal to? What's the proper tactic for him? Appeal to him as a father because there's a missing young girl, and it seemed to work.
Seemed to work. I don't know if the police had a lot to work with. And look at it from the other side. It could have worked. It might not have worked because for a man to just callously and coldly kill people, including 2 children, 2 teenagers.
Yes.
What kind of father is he? I don't think he's reading bedtime stories, right? I don't think he's that kind of father. So luckily it worked, but the police you can only work with what you have to work with, right?
Right.
So they honed in on the one thing that they thought would be successful, and they were correct in their assessment.
Pretty incredible stuff, and I keep saying it, I can't wait for trial to start. I'm keeping a careful eye on that feed. I want it to start. I want to hear the rest of this confession tape. And you know what? I know you do too. So we're going to, as soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go to it. Nothing happening yet, but we are going to finally hear Anthony Kirkland confessing, and that is going to be something to listen to. So we'll take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot more to cover. Stay tuned. Pretty incredible stuff. You're hearing this detective prying out that confession from the defendant, and we're going to talk about that case in a minute. But before we do, I want to give you an update. If you want to go to lawandcrime.com right now, you can follow another case that we're covering in Ohio. We have a live feed. It is that case I mentioned at the top of the program. It's that case against Sean O'Connell, a former detective who faces many different charges in relation to what his prosecutors are saying was a botched investigation into the homicide of Heather Boggle. He faces obstruction of official business, dereliction of duty charges, coercion, unauthorized use of property. A lot at stake for this detective. I recommend going to lawandcrime.com if you want to follow that case. But We are going to follow the Anthony Kirkland case here on the network. There's so much to talk about right now. I want to bring back in Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, as we talked about in the break, this almost feels like a mini trial because even though this is just the sentencing phase, his guilt has already been decided. This jury never heard any of those details before.
Right, so they need to hear them now. But, you know, these details are really pretty much a foregone conclusion. And this phase of the sentencing phase is a little different than a typical sentencing phase in a death penalty case because we're not hearing about any sort of mitigating circumstances that might surround the defendant. That'll come. I highly expect it'll come, but we're not there yet. Right now, we're just walking the jury through these horrific murders that this man committed.
And you hear the detective saying that Kirkland's playing games right now. He's giving some details, some things that just don't make sense about how he would know where the body is based upon what he's saying, the statements that he received from this guy Pedro. Some of it doesn't add up, but eventually this confession is what the police get to nab him on 5 different murders. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. This is some pretty exciting back and forth between the defendant and the detective in this case in that confession room. We'll talk more about it in a minute. I do have a breaking report, though, in the other case that we were covering out of Ohio, the Sean O'Connell case. A USA Today reporter has just broke the news that Sean O'Connell has pled guilty to felony tampering with evidence. It's a felony 3, and all remaining charge against O'Connell have probably just been now dropped. This is a pretty exciting update, but it means that there will not be a trial as we initially thought. So if there's an update about that case, we'll let you know, but you can follow more on lawandcrime.com. I want to bring back in Jonna Spilbor. This back and forth between Kirkland and the interviewer is really something to see. It's very frustrating, right? Giving pieces of the details of what happened to this girl. Did he kill her? How do you know? Where do you know her body is? This back and forth, he was getting frustrated.
Well, yeah, eventually he was getting frustrated because, like I said before, this isn't a situation where you sit down with a potential mass murderer and get all the details in one fell swoop and it all makes sense and it all lines up. That's not how it works, right? So he had to really pull this information from him to make sure that it could be verified. You have to corroborate. You know, a confession alone is not enough. You have to be able to corroborate what's coming out of that defendant's mouth. And so he needed to carefully pull these facts and get as many details as he could. And he did a very good job at the end of the day.
This is what I think a 7-hour interrogation tape. You can see how it takes so long to get that information out. I mean, it's just, and this is some pretty excruciating details, as you heard the detective say. We're talking about a child and you're playing games. That was an interesting back and forth. We will have to take a break here on the network, but when we come back, John and I are going to talk a little bit more about this case, but we are going to go live. We don't want you to miss anything about this police interrogation tape out of Ohio. We'll be back right after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. That was some pretty exciting stuff. You heard the conclusion of the police interview, and that was Keith Witherell from the Cincinnati Police Department. He was the one who was on tape interviewing Mr. Kirkland. I want to get the reaction from Jonna Spilbor right now. Jonna, what is your reaction to listening to that tape?
You know, well, it's always hard to hear when you know somebody has committed multiple murders, and in this one he's discussing what he did to a young girl. So this fresh jury has to sit there and listen to these details. There's really not a lot, you know, there's no defense to the actual crimes. We're here for a resentencing. So they have to get it all, they have to get all the facts, and then we're going to get into the more of why should we spare his life or not portion of the program.
Well, you talk about that, and I want to address that right now. We believe that he is going to introduce evidence that he suffers from some sort of mental disease or defect as a form of a mitigating factor. Will that work in this case? This guy has killed 5 different people, but maybe the other way of looking at it is, hey, maybe he really can't control his behavior. You
know, and that can cut both ways, right? Because the Supreme Court has long ago, they held in Virginia versus Atkins, that if you suffer from an intellectual disability, meaning you're not that smart, that you cannot be put to death. I don't know if this guy, I don't know what his IQ is. I don't know if we've established that yet.
Well, we were listening to him in the tape. He seems to know what's going on.
He seems he can carry on a conversation, and he doesn't, you know, he seems like he's average intelligence.
Yeah, he's manipulative.
So we won't be able to check that box. But if he's got some sort of mental defect, if he was abused as a child, I mean, we hear that argument all the time. Will that be enough for the jury to hang their hat on and say, you know what, now he deserves his life to be spared? Perhaps. But another jury didn't do that. Another jury already sentenced him to death.
Real quick, John, 5 seconds. Maybe I'll ask you this after. I was going to ask you whether or not, if he can't control his behavior, could that excuse it? We'll get your answer right after this quick break, because that's a lot of discussion. We'll be back right after this. Okay, so we're going to hear another police interrogation tape, this one for Detective Bill Hilbert, and he's going to first talk to Kirkland about the Mary Jo murder, and then he's going to move on to the Cassandra Crawford case probably later on. As you just heard, he wanted to first talk about this with Kirkland because this was an adult, and he probably felt he could get more information about what happened to an adult victim as opposed to a child victim. Again, I'm here with Jonna Spilbor. Interesting strategy, correct?
Well, work smarter, not harder, right? It seems to make sense that when you're dealing with a serial killer, that you're going to start with the adult that he can relate to more, and then move on to the more. They're all sympathetic victims, but you know, when you kill a child, you're a special kind of evil.
Yeah, and Mr. Kirkland knows that. And what's interesting is he keeps being accused of playing games and that he's manipulative. Did you get that sense in his other interview?
Yeah, I did get a little bit of that sense, and it's interesting because they Mirandized him, and he waived his right to have an attorney with him throughout this interrogation.
What do you think about that? The fact that he had the opportunity to get a lawyer, could have spoken, and he didn't.
You know, if he's smart enough to know that, you know, he can waive his right to have one, so that tells us that he's not dumb. But number two, he's probably so narcissistic at this point, I think he planned to confess, and it was just going to be a slow burn.
Or try to manipulate the story the way that he wanted, get the story out in front of him. It's been a really interesting case to follow. When we we're going to have to take a quick break in a minute, and then when we come back, we're going to really get into this interview. But in the meantime, unfortunately, I have to say so long to Jonna Spilbor. I hate always doing it, Jonna.
Where does the time go?
It goes into these police interrogation tapes. Final thoughts, 20 seconds or so as we go into the next chapter of this case.
This guy's going to fry. You want my final thoughts? That's my final. This jury's not going to do anything different than the previous, and it's probably deserved.
Well, sparing no thoughts there. Jonna, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot more in the Anthony Kirkland case.